Is this the face of Anne Boleyn? This sketch by Hans Holbein the Younger has long divided opinion about who the sitter is. Some are convinced that it is Anne, whilst others believe it cannot be her. Still, recent research by Dr. Kate Hurd, curator of the Royal Collections Trust, suggests that this preparatory drawing is our most complete contemporary image of Anne Boleyn known to survive. But is this Anne? The sketch shows a woman in a fur-trimmed nightgown, a high-neck chemise embroidered in black work, and a simple coif on her head. The sitter is contemplative, her dark eyes are downcast as if reading. The fact that Holbein made this sketch on pink primed paper tells us that it was made during his second visit to England, between 1532 and his death in 1543. Holbein's earlier sketches from his first visit were made exclusively on white-coated paper, so we can be sure that this sketch was made after 1532, when he used pink. Now, one of the reasons that this sketch has been dismissed as being Anne is that the sitter is in a relative state of undress. Is it likely that the Queen of England will be depicted in her nightgown without the trappings of majesty? First, we must recognise that this is a preparatory drawing, not the final product. Holbein often made changes between the draft sketches and the final piece he created, changing the jewellery and garments the sitter was sketched in for the final painting. However, we should also consider that this sketch may not have been made for a publicly displayed panel portrait, but instead for a more intimate miniature painting. Let's consider this miniature portrait of King Henry VIII's son, Henry Fitzroy, the Duke of Richmond, which was created between 1533 and 1534 by the court artist Lucas Hornboot. He is depicted in casual clothes in a coif or nightcap and chemise, similar to Holbein's sketch of Anne. The Richmond miniature is believed to be a wedding portrait and therefore was an intimate object for private eyes only. Could therefore the sketch labelled as Anne have been made for such an intimate reason? This miniature of Marguerite d'Angoulême similarly shows the French king's sister in a state of undress, so we can confidently say that it wouldn't have been unusual for a woman of Anne's station to be depicted like this. In November 1532, Anne would marry the king, going through a second wedding ceremony in January 1533, before being crowned queen when heavily pregnant. Could this have been an intimate study of a queen in waiting, a mother-to-be, a wife, a queen? But what of that hair colour? Didn't Anne Boleyn have raven black hair when the sketch shows blonde hair? Now, fascinatingly, we don't actually have any solid contemporary evidence of what Anne's hair colour was. Thomas Wyatt was likely referring to Anne when he called her brunette. But in the 16th century, that word could also be applied to someone's complexion, and we know from eyewitness accounts that Anne had a dark, sallow skin tone. The first mention of her having black hair comes over 40 years after her death, from a man who had never seen Anne. What we can be sure of is that red hair is a recessive trait, so for the red-haired Henry to have fathered the red-haired Elizabeth, Anne must also have been a carrier of the MC1R gene. Indeed, some posthumous Elizabethan portraits of Anne show her with red hair. But does this sketch only show blonde hair? Well, research by Dr. Kate Hurd shows that there was once far more variety of colour on the hair, with traces of red, brown and black chalk still visible on the hairline. Holbein layered his colours for depth, and therefore the yellow was a base colour used for the highlights, with the darker colours having sadly worn away over time. Only remnants of these colours are still visible. Holbein's chalk only sat on the paper's surface and wouldn't have been absorbed into the paper, and therefore it was vulnerable to being wiped away over time. However, the Italian engraver Francesco Bartolozzi had access to Holbein's sketches before 1797, and he captured the sketch labelled as Anne in colour. If we look at the colour Bartolozzi applied, we can see browns, reds and blacks, with a lighter area peeping through as highlights. This might just give us a flavour of what Holbein may originally have intended Anne's hair to look like before his chalk rubbed away. Some historians have suggested that the presence of this coat of arms on the verso or reverse of the sketch discounts it as being Anne, as the arms derive from the Wyatt family. However, this is the only extant example in the royal collection of a Holbein sketch with any drawing on the reverse, so we can't say that Holbein added this to the paper as an identifier. Indeed, Holbein often added additional details pertinent to the composition on the front of the sketch, not the reverse. Dr. Kate Hurd suggests that when Anne Boleyn was executed in May 1536, this piece of paper became redundant for making copies. Being an expensive commodity, Holbein likely reused the reverse side of the paper when working on a memorial to Sir Henry Wyatt, who died in November 1537. But our best evidence that this is Anne Boleyn comes from the inscription identifying it as her. We know that Holbein's sketches were once mounted in a great book that Sir John Cheek, that's Edward VI's tutor, was tasked with identifying each sitter, labelling the pages of the book to which the sketches were mounted, rather than labelling the sketches themselves. Cheek had gained a scholarship from King Henry VIII, and, thanks to the research of Natalie Gruneger, we now know that he visited court in 1534, when Anne Boleyn was queen. Cheek then gained financial support from Anne for his student William Bill. He therefore almost certainly would have been familiar with what Anne Boleyn looked like, and was certainly surrounded by people who would have recognised Anne's image when he labelled it as Anne. Holbein's sketches were later removed from the Great Book in 1727 for Queen Caroline, when each sketch had Cheek's identification added to it, taken from the mount pages that Cheek had written on. For me, this is compelling evidence that this is a sketch of Anne Boleyn, likely made during her queenship, and perhaps even during a pregnancy. It was likely captured for a private, intimate portrait miniature, now lost. The erosion of the impermanent chalk has masked Anne's darker hair colour, but thankfully some remnants remain. This is almost certainly Anne Boleyn, depicted as Queen, and it is likely the clearest, most detailed image that we currently have of her from her lifetime.